Now, Denmark has sent a frigate to the Red Sea, where it will participate in a U.S.-led coalition to safeguard commercial traffic against attacks by Yemen's Houthi militants. The frigate carries U.S.-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles and ESSM surface-to-air interceptor missiles. Still, according to the Danish Navy Command, it will not be able to defend itself or other ships against ballistic missiles. It says the Danish Special Operation Forces, previously used to combat pirates in the Gulf of Guinea, will not be participating in this operation. The Iran-aligned Houthi have launched waves of exploding drones and missiles at commercial and Navy vessels since November 19 in response to Israel's military operations in Gaza.
Det en vigtig mission. Det en prioritet for.
It's an important mission, it's a priority for the government and fortunately also for a broad majority in parliament that we are now securing that effort, and the terror-like activity that the Houthis are committing in and around the Red Sea, that we must do everything to stop and not least protect civilian ship traffic. It's important to say that if you think that the answer to the Houthis is to simply allow them to terrorize free world trade, you are on the wrong track. That is also why we, together with the Americans and the British, are now showing responsibility. That contributes to sending a signal that we will not.
Well, for the very latest, I'm joined now live here from Tel Aviv by our special correspondent, Karl Bostic. Good to see you, Karl, and thanks for your time. Let's talk more about this very unfortunate incident. You had spoken about the fear of getting this out of hand. It seemed that this is being escalated by the unfortunate killing of some U.S. troops. Let us in on what you know more.
Well, that's right. To be honest, many felt, back in the U.S. at the White House and even in the region that it was only going to be a matter of time before you came to a point like this. Because since that October 7th massacre here in Israel, where Hamas, attacked, Israelis and then set off, this crisis, there have been at least 160 attacks against U.S. troops in the region. Based mainly in Iraq and Syria. There are about 2,000 troops, for example, in Iraq, another 900 in Syria. They're there basically to keep up their fight against the Islamic State, ISIS. However, this was a very tiny outpost in Jordan, the northeastern corner of Jordan, and it was called very anonymously Tower 22, right at the convergence of the Jordan border with Iraq and Syria. And actually, it was just really an outpost to try to fight the supply of arms and weapons from Iran to Syria and Iraq. And what happened on Sunday was that one single armed drone attacked and exploded the living quarters of U.S. personnel, where about 250 soldiers were residing and based. And you had 3 soldiers killed and about 3 dozen injured. Again, keep it in context. There have been 160 incidences of attacks like this since October 7th. But this is the first time that you've had U.S. fatalities. And that's why people are saying that this is a red line that the U.S. cannot ignore. You've got hardline critics in the U.S. saying that the U.S., cannot avoid even maybe acting directly in Iran by having a strike inside Iran. Others saying that they don't want to provoke a war with Iran. Again, the White House is saying we don't want a war with Iran, but this is a proxy war that has now really gone too far. So they have to send a clear message. But again, there are a lot of deterrents out there. I mean, for example, you have to keep in mind Iran could easily sabotage the Strait of Hormuz, where 1/3 of the world's oil is shipped by sea, with drones and rockets. They could completely shut it down and cut it off. I think what many are looking for is for the U.S. to maybe take out senior Iranian personnel, as they did with Qasem Soleimani back in 2020, who was the head of the Islamic Republican Guard, and maybe go after someone like him. The question becomes, where would that be? In Iran, in Yemen, or Syria, or Iraq? But people do expect a response, but as President Biden said, it would be at a time of our choosing.
And Karl, yes, as rightly said, this is the first time that the U.S. is losing some of his troops outside the shores of the United States since this crisis started. But again, the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Nasir Kanani has spoken, where specifically, I give you a quote here, he says, the Islamic Republic, these groups don't take orders from the Islamic Republic. Let us in on what he's trying to say here, taking the government away from these groups.
Well, it's called really, it's called plausible deniability, saying that, we're not directing these attacks, but then that's like saying we're not directing the attacks carried about the Houthis in the Red Sea. And yet these groups, they're armed, trained, and financed by Iran. And that was the whole point of setting up this proxy system that Qasem Soleimani had set up, proxies dedicated to the mission of Iran's foreign policy. And that's what this group carried out. Because, again, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which did claim responsibility for this attack, it did say in its statement that as long as the war continues in Gaza, as long as the U.S. backs Israel, as long as Israel continues to wage war, these attacks will continue. So in that respect, the road leads back to Tehran. And that's why, many hardliners are saying in the U.S., like Senator Lindsey Graham was a hardline Republican hawk, saying that, we can't avoid, showing that we have to deliver a tougher message, going directly to Tehran. The challenge for Biden is this: how do you avoid a wider war while sending a stronger message that this can no longer be tolerated? That's the difficulty right there. And yet here I am in Israel, and people are saying it's long overdue that the U.S. struck back and actually hit Iran directly.
And we'll come back to you, Karl. You stay with us. We'll be coming back to speak to you on some other developments pretty much later here on the news. You're watching Arise News Hour. Still ahead. Turkish authorities have captured 2 gunmen who shot 1 person dead at a church in Istanbul. Stay with us. Welcome back to Arise News Hour with me, Sulaiman, our leader here in Abuja. Now, more countries have halted funding to the largest UN agency operating in Gaza as the crisis deepens over the alleged role of some staff in the October 7 Hamas attacks on Israel. Japan and Austria say they're suspending payments to the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. The US, UK, Germany and Italy are also among those who have suspended funding. Several members of staff have been let go following the allegations of their involvement in the attack that led to the death of over 1,300 people, mainly civilians, and taking nearly 250 others back to Gaza as hostages. UNRWA has said if the funding does not resume, the agency will not be able to continue its operations beyond the end of February. Now, the EU demands an urgent audit of the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, and says it is receiving or reviewing funding following Israeli allegations that some staff participated in Hamas' October 7 attack. The audit should be held by European Commission-appointed experts and be conducted alongside a UN investigation into the claims, Commission spokesman Eric Mama told journalists.
We have extremely serious allegations against staff working for UNRWA. And it is absolutely obvious that these allegations need to be investigated seriously and without delay.
Well, all right, special correspondent Karl Bostic is still with me. And Karl, what do we make of this situation? It is really, really disturbing.
Suleiman, not only disturbing, it's astonishing, it's explosive. To put things in perspective, UNRWA is the biggest aid agency in Gaza. UNRWA, United Nations agency, set up after 1948, which was the creation of the Israeli state. And because there was so much, dispute at stake in terms of where do Palestinians call their home, they created this agency to take care of those who had been displaced, those Palestinian, quote unquote, refugees who had been displaced because of the creation of the Israeli state. Well, now since 1948, 4 generations later, technically, many Palestinians still qualify as a refugee. And that's why you have the situation you have right now in Gaza, the United Nations Agency for Welfare and Relief. So as a result, it provides education, food, relief, shelter, you name it. About 500,000 Gaza children go to school at UNRWA facilities. They have about 155 schools in Gaza. About 12,000 staff employees in Gaza, the vast majority, who are Gaza residents. So that was kind of like, in many ways, a time bomb just ticking, because as long as Hamas was in control, quite frankly, the way it's set up there now, you wouldn't get a job anywhere in Gaza, especially a well-paying job, unless you were part of Hamas. And so Israel on Friday, after the International Court ruling in The Hague, presented its dossier of what it claimed and showed that at least 12 people who are UNRWA staff employees were involved with the participation of the October 7th attack and also the days following it. And they included 7 teachers, primary and secondary, teachers in Arabic and mathematics, who were involved with carrying out the killings at one of the kibbutzes, Kibbutz Be'eri, on October 7th, taking back bodies to Gaza, and in one case, kidnapping a woman and taking her back to the apartment of an UNRWA staffer. So all of that was going on, and they proved this or backed this up by showing that they had cell phone tracking data, because they monitored cell phone calls, they monitored text messages, and they had interrogations of those Hamas militants who had been captured. So that all came together, and on the basis of that, that's why you see, this suspension by a number of countries. The primary donors of UNRWA are saying that we need to put a pause on this, because it looks like UNRWA has been really come like a haven for Hamas, as Israel claims. And now the Wall Street Journal is claiming that out of the 12,000 employees of UNRWA, at least 10% are Hamas members. And then it goes on further to say that about 49% of UNRWA staff members, 49% have relatives who are members of Hamas or militant groups. So this is a real perversion of such. The problem is, you have one aid agency in Gaza, Action Aid, saying that, listen, if you pull the plug on funding in UNRWA, the biggest aid agency in Gaza, that's a death sentence for the 2.3 million Gazans right now at this time of war. So it's a real dilemma right now, especially as Israel is trying to show that it's trying all it can, that it is weighing in humanitarian responses, even while it carries out its war against Hamas.
Karl, because this is an emergency, so it becomes almost impossible for them to have an audit of the bad guys within the UNRWA and get the good guys working. Do you see a possibility of that coming into play at the moment?
Well, Suleiman, to be honest, Suleiman, you just answered your question. How do you carry out an audit like this in the middle of the war? I think, if anything, it's part of the conversation about what Gaza looks like after the war. Because again, I've been to Gaza, now almost 20 years. Last time I was in Gaza was for Arise 2014. I went to one of those schools, and the society there is very aid dependent. They're dependent on UNRWA especially. And the problem is, if UNRWA doesn't exist, then who takes its place? Israel does not want that responsibility of taking care of Gazan residents. And that's why you actually have a growing sentiment of Israelis, even liberal people that I've spoken with here in Tel Aviv, saying, listen, Gaza will never be a stable place. It'll always be a threat to Israel. They need to be deported or repopulated voluntarily. It's really, really a growing sentiment of mood. And as for the audit that you talk about, nonetheless, you've got to deal with a humanitarian response. You've got heartbreaking scenes of the collapse of a health system, the mass displacement of 90% of the people. 93% of the people are facing, starvation or famine. So no, how can you pull the plug on UNRWA at this time of war? And in fact, the UNRWA head is saying that after February, UNRWA will not be able to function. That's the dilemma right there. But I'll also say this one final quick note, because we began the conversation talking about what happened in Jordan and attacks against American servicemen. This is rippling across the region. Now, for the first time in nearly 3-4 weeks, once again, rockets are coming across Tel Aviv, sirens are blaring, and people are scrambling to their shelter, and you're hearing explosions. So the point is that this is an ongoing war. It's dynamic, and the threat is still there. And now to talk about, suspending aid to the Gazans who need help, it doesn't really kind of make sense. But of course, it shows the anxiety at stake when you now are finding out that a substantial, significant portion of UNRWA employees were now participants in this attack and even helped in carrying it out, kidnapping them, and even transporting bodies back to Gaza. That's a lot to take in.
You stay safe, Karl Bostic. Many thanks, our special correspondent live there in Tel Aviv.